What's going on, kids? So far we've looked at kind of where the air goes into our engine through the intake manifold, where the air leaves our engine through the exhaust manifold. We've looked at the spark that explodes that mixture of air and fuel, but we haven't really looked at the compression part of those four strokes. Remember, we have intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. So today we're going to do a compression test, taking a look at exactly how tightly that air and fuel is squeezed down before our spark fires. So to run this compression test, we're going to use our compression test kit, and we need to figure out which one of these adapters is going to thread into our engine where our spark plugs went. So I've got a new set of plugs. Remember, we're going to replace the plugs every time we pull them out because this has one of those crush washers on it. I need to figure out which one of these adapters has the same threads as my plug. Other thing to pay attention to on this tester is there's a little Schrader valve, just like the same thing you have in your tire valve stem, that if your readings are a little bit wonky, sometimes you might need to swap that Schrader valve out. We've got a gauge here that goes all the way up to 300 PSI, and we're going to jump on Identifix here in a minute and take a look at exactly what number we should be seeing as our individual cylinders bump up on their compression stroke. So this is the adapter that we're going to have to use for today. And the other thing that we need to do before we start our compression test is let our engine warm up. So I'm going to start the car, and then we're going to take a look at what numbers we should be finding for this compression test on Identifix. And then we're also going to take a look at the procedure that we're going to need to do once the engine is up to 10. All right, so while the Del Sol idle surges away in the background because of a gnarly intake leak or vacuum leak, let's jump on Identifix and take a look at exactly what type of compression numbers we should be looking for during this compression test. So we're going to look up the compression numbers for a 2000 CRV. That's close enough to the motor that's in that car. And instead of doing the search function like we've done in the past, we're going to come down to this quick hits area and then take a look at all motor specifications. This is going to be kind of a one-stop shop on Identifix that's going to have a whole bunch of specs where if all you're looking for is the numbers because you already know how to do the job, let's say torque specs or compression specs in our case, or fuel pressure specs, anything like that, they're all going to be here in this motor specs page. So for compression, we're going to look here for engine compression. And this tells us that we should be looking at somewhere between 135 PSI and 178 PSI. And then this last bit here is important. There should be no more than 28 PSI difference between all four of our cylinders. You don't want one cylinder to be at 135 and then all three of your other cylinders at 175. Because that really tells you that there's an issue with one specific cylinder. You want the compression to be pretty much even across the board, that way your engine runs nice and smooth. Because remember, if you have a misfire or one combustion stroke isn't quite as strong as the other ones, the engine's going to slow down for a fraction of a second and then speed back up as soon as that next cylinder goes on its combustion stroke, and that's going to give you kind of a rough idle or a vibration in the car. So now that we have our numbers, let's go back out to the car and do our actual compression test. So now that we have our compression numbers, while I was on Identifix, I also pulled up the diagram for the underhood relay box. We need to remove the fuel from this equation when we're trying to do our compression test because we don't want the injectors firing while our engine cranks over. We're not going to have our spark plugs in there. We don't need to be spraying fuel when we don't need to. So on the underhood relay, I can see there's a fuse. It's fuse number 31. It's going to be 15 amps, and that fuse controls the EFI. Right? So this is basically our computer controlling when the fuel fires. So we need to remove our fuel injector fuse. And if I come back to my chart, I know that I'm looking at spot number 31, and I'm looking for a 15 amp fuse. So let's go over to the car and take a look at this fuse box. So over here in the corner, we have our underhood relay, and I could jump on Identifix and go to component locations if I was having trouble finding this. On most modern vehicles, there's going to be a little diagram right underneath on the bottom, but it looks like it fell off at some point in the last 30 years on this car, so set that off to the side. And we'll have to use our reference here to figure out which fuse does what. So again, we're looking for fuse number 31 in the top left corner. So if we look, we have a 15 amp fuse in the top left corner, and that's going to be our ECU fuel injection fuse, and I'll pull that, and then we'll try and start the car and make sure that it doesn't actually fire. We got a whole lot of nothing, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Alright, so now the engine's not going to start, it's time for us to start pulling our plugs. And this is the same procedure that we did before. Make sure you don't drop anything on the exhaust manifold, because again, that's hot, the engine is up to temp. So we'll pull that all over to the side, and then we're going to remove all 4 of our spark plugs. We can do a quick inspection and they all look okay. They're not fouled out, they're not wet with fuel or anything like that. Looks like we're in good shape to continue on with our compression test. So here's our compression tester, and we're going to take the end that we know is the correct threads for our spark plugs and send it down to the hole for cylinder 1. And once this is lined up, it's just going to thread in nice and easy by hand. And just give it a little twist. There's a little rubber O-ring on the bottom that's going to help hold compression. And then you'll use the quick connect to hook this up. And then we need to go inside the car, and we're going to hold the throttle pedal all the way down to make sure that we can get as much air into the cylinder as possible, and then turn the engine over. When you look up the description on how to do this test on some vehicles, it may give you a number of puffs that you need. And as I crank the engine over, you're going to see this gauge click up a couple of times. Some manufacturers give you a spec for, after 4 puffs, which is 4 compression strokes of that cylinder. Other manufacturers will just give you a compression flat number, and that's the maximum compression after it stops going up. So I believe Honda is maximum, so we're going to crank this thing until it stops moving up. And we're also going to take a look at how much it jumps for the first puff, because sometimes manufacturers will have a spec for the first bump and then the 4th bump or whatever. So yeah, let me get going here. There we go. And if we read our compression, we're right there at about 170 psi. So now we just need to repeat that same procedure across all the cylinders, and we're going to write these numbers down as we go. Once again, right at 170. Just a hair under 170. And finally, just a couple of PSI again, right underneath 170. All right, so there you go. I'll put all of our numbers somewhere up here so we can see, but remember, our range was somewhere between 135 PSI and 185 PSI. And we were right there between like 168 to 170 PSI across all the cylinders. That's really pretty good for a 20-year-old motor that's in this thing. And I wouldn't have any issues putting this thing back together and sending it back on the road. The motor is mechanically sound. This is a test that you can do on pretty much any gasoline engine if you're trying to see if the engine is healthy in the car that you just bought. Or if you're going to buy a new car and you're taking it in for an inspection someplace, this is a good test to ask for because it lets you know the strength of the motor. Now, if some of those numbers are a little bit wonky, there's some other tests that you may want to do. You can do what's called a wet compression test and put a couple drops of oil down each of the cylinders. Run the test again, and if the numbers come up to where they should be, that lets you know you have an issue with the rings around your piston. If that test doesn't tell you anything, it lets you know that the air is escaping somewhere up top, whether that be an issue with the valve seats where those valves close into the head, or possibly a head gasket issue that you can diagnose with something called a leak down test, where you send pressurized air in through that spark plug hole using this same tool with a quick connect valve from your shop air and some sort of valve to regulate the pressure. But that's a compression test. It's a pretty quick and easy way to tell the overall health of an engine. And it's a really, really useful diagnostic tool if you have an issue with, let's say, one particular cylinder or a rough idle. You can try and figure out, is it a mechanical problem with the motor itself? If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, be good, and I will see you next time.